Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Comic Speedrun. I'm going to try to get all of this finished today. This is what I have right now. I did this and then I didn't touch it for 2.5 weeks. So I'm going to see if I can get all of this done today, plus all of the other stuff that I need to do. I have that timer rotation and shit going, so we'll see if I can fucking get it done. And I didn't want to have to worry about filming while I was drawing, so I'm just filming this in, what's the word? In case? No, that's not, it's a different, hold on. Case. Contingent. Is that it? Anyway, I don't want to have to worry about filming, so I'm going to try and be as fast as possible and succinct and just film intermittently and give updates whenever I remember to. Okay, so here's my speedrun comic book page, any percent, sometime today, hopefully. Okay, so I worked for about an hour or so and I was able to get this rough sketch done. So I have made some semblance of progress. I think this panel slash pose is my favorite. I really like the way that she's leaning over and the balance of like her shoulder and arm and stuff. Okay, I have finished this guy and now I am tracing. It's one of those things where there's a little bit that's lost in translation. Like there's a little bit of an offset. There are some slight cropping or like placement issues sometimes one panel's a little off centered and I have to fix that, but it's pretty simple. I just have to figure out how zoomed in the page has to be for the size of the 11x17 paper. I forgot to film everything else. Oops. Okay, so I did manage to record about 30 minutes or so of me inking, so this is the part of the video that I like to call Reagan's podcast, where I just ramble about whatever's on my brain. So I was able to do a sort of live stream setup. It's bad and very basic, but a couple people watched, which was cool. And so one person, Billy, actually asked me a question about like what makes a fantasy world feel real, and I was struggling with drawing and talking to the people in chat and learning how to use Clip Studio Paint and learning how to stream for the first time. And I feel like I might not be the person to ask this question. I mean, thank you for asking the question. Thank you for watching my stream. And I tried to, answer what I think makes a world feel real in my experience and examples that I like, but I feel like I didn't answer it right. Like I didn't answer it correctly or succinctly. I mean, I gave a answer, which was sort of like those little things, like thinking about like what the small, not small, but like the small interactions between people. Like what does the restaurant in town that everybody thinks has the best food, what's a running argument between like two neighbors? What's a bad omen that people in this village see versus what's a bad omen in another neighborhood? But at the same time, I don't think I'm necessarily the question asked for this. This is mostly for me, a way for me to sort of analyze this question and pick it apart and things and notes for myself. So for me to internalize and to take with me to better world build in the future in my own stuff. And if someone's still watching and they get something out of what I say, great. When there's so many good YouTube channels, writers, comic book artists, world builders, novelists out there. A few of them that are on YouTube are Lily's Illustration, Eternal Ruins, Monster Garden, Ritfitch, Hello Future Me, and Lines in Motion. Some of them are artists who are making their own world and world building, and they make videos about specific people or things, or I mean, Monster Garden even made his own video about the currency of the world, and that in itself is a very cool video. Like the currency of the like hands and fingers and like knuckles and all of this other different stuff, and then he starts talking about different sayings that people would have in that world because of what they call their money and what their money looks like. And so then that's also a really cool video. Ritfitch has an excellent magic system, absolutely beautiful magic system, and how each culture in that world sort of interprets and treats their magic users in different ways. That's very very involved and detailed and beautiful. Hello Future Me and Lines in Motion have a lot more like analytic videos on other pieces of art. Hello Future Me does a lot of educational world building videos, and so does Lines in Motion. While Lily's Illustration, Eternal Ruins, Monster Garden, Ritfitch are currently building their own worlds and world building, if that makes sense. So both of those things are very valuable. And there's also dozens of other people that are making beautiful art and analyzing other art in an educational way that is very good to look at and learn about. Yeah, so things that I need to keep in mind when world building is when making lore or writing, I need to learn the balance between giving myself a structure and giving myself room to build on and grow that structure. Like, I don't have to solve every problem right. I don't have to solve every problem or answer every question right away, but exploring that space, and maybe later down the line, I'm at a point where I can ask myself this question, because not everything in your world needs to be explained or solved. In our own world, right? On this real life floating rock that we live on, there are so many unanswered questions about just the animals, biologically, there are so many undiscovered species, like the freaking Marianas Trench. Like, we've only discovered a fraction of the ocean, right? Like, that's crazy. There are so many crazy different geological mysteries. And then also thinking about, there are so many gaps in our history, our ancient history, why certain cultures did what they did. There's things like the freaking like Voynich manuscript. Is that how you pronounce that? That's just like a language that somebody made up and no one knows what the hell it is, but people are fascinated with it because they're like, want to figure it out, want to break that code. And so having mysteries like that in your own world that either are going to be solved very later down the line, or that will never be solved, that will just be a cool thing in your world building. Like, maybe there is a chasm or a crater that has always been there, was made in ancient times, and no one knows why, right? And then historians in your in the world that I'm making or you're making or whatever are arguing about like what happened when it happened, right? Some people might be like, oh, it was made 8,000 years ago. Oh no, it was made like 20,000 years ago, and it's a hot topic of debate, right? Things like that. You don't have to answer every question before you start writing. I mentioned like little moments of how people live, right? If I'm making a port fishing town, right? Obviously they eat a lot of seafood. Okay, what's a recipe that a grandmother makes for her grandchildren when they're sick, right? Is there a person who's trying to figure out like a recipe that their uncle left for them, and it's handwritten, and he didn't use any actual measurements, and he doesn't give too much. He just is like, add some tomatoes, and they're like, well, how many is some tomatoes, right? That's something that's happened in my family, and I feel like that could also add to the world building of something as well, right? Those like having food that is common that people eat, and not only that, but food that people eat for certain occasions, right? And then that can fuel the sort of macro world building of what are the imports and exports, right? They probably export a lot of fish to not only if it's if it's a city, they might export things internationally. They might be a international sort of trade port, right? And then you can think about how many people from other countries in your world live there, and how that also influences the food that these people might eat. What sayings do they have? What like superstitions, like what's considered good luck, what's bad luck, what's their version of like crossing their fingers or knock on wood or throwing salt over their shoulder or accidentally walking over a ladder or shattering a mirror, right? All of these are things in our world. What's their version? Instead of seeing like ravens on top of a roof, what if it is a place that has a lot of maybe something like monkeys? So if it's a place that's maybe in the mountains, they have monkeys or chimpanzees that live near there. Maybe if they see like one of the chimpanzees do something, that's considered good luck or bad luck, right? There might also be things like a counterculture, right? Depending on how stable you want your world to be, right? Like maybe you're like, okay, I want to talk about like a government being overthrown and then a new government's taking place. Well, there might be a lot of counterculture, right? There might be things that the common majority are wearing, but there might also be like a punk or goth equivalent in your world, a like small counterculture of people that want to show how dissatisfied they are with a certain societal element by wearing certain things or listening to certain music. Things like clothing, music, and food are so important and can tell so much. I mean, that's why things like character design, like the clothing that people wear, are very important. One of the reasons why I like Campaign Skyjack so much is because they really focus on folklore and local traditions and music. They have their own music for the podcast Arnie Parrott, excellent music. If you like, like sailor shanty type music, listen to the Campaign Skyjacks albums, and also just listen to Campaign Skyjacks. It's about sky pirates. But anyway, they really focus on like folklore and local traditions, and that's what a lot of the world building is based off of. Like these folk traditions that are orally passed down throughout the generations, and then each city or town has different variations of that, right? They have macro rules of the world, like water is bad, the mariner is evil, trying to destroy the world, the ocean is bad, so they use griffin birds and sky ships for travel, and there's so much room and fluidity in the storytelling because of the way that the world doesn't have countries or anything. It allows each city and town to be its own semi-isolated culture that they can play around with. But then obviously there are, since there is travel like sky ships and birds, there is a intermingling of culture in certain areas, like Bujanith, for example, which is a like bustling sort of metropolis. They have a lot of people coming in and out. So there are a lot of people from various cultures that reside there, and then those cultures sort of mingle and melt amongst themselves. yeah, so the fact that they're like, okay, we're building a new city and town, what's something fun that we can draw from our real world and use here? Like Nordia, they drew a lot of Nordia. They drew a lot of Nordic inspiration from a lot of the culture. Yeah, Skyjax is really cool. And in something like the Hunger Games, and Suzanne Collins is kind of the opposite, right? It has a very oppressive government force. I mean, Campaign Skyjax has like the Red Feather Syndicate and the Church of the Slain God, but so the the capital in the Hunger Games, right, is a very oppressive force, but the capital has its own culture, and then each of the districts in themselves have their own culture and stories. And things like songs in the Hunger Games are so important, right? Funeral songs, wedding songs, rebellion songs, and the oppression of those songs by the capital tells you a lot about the world itself. And of course, Suzanne Collins is an incredible author, uses a lot of motifs, right? Birds and snakes, and of course fire and roses, and there's just like so much to unpack there. And I know that I'm using that as an example because Campaign Skyjax is an incredibly niche example to use, but Hunger Games is a very well-known thing, so I'm trying to balance sort of the examples that I'm using. But people like Suzanne Collins, as well as in Campaign Skyjax, draw a lot from history, and of course, Suzanne Collins was drawing a lot from current events at the time as well, the War on Terror and all of that. But history is a great place to look. I would recommend the Fall of Civilization podcast. Has videos on YouTube as well as they're on Spotify and Patreon. It gives you a lovely peek of what it's like to live in ancient times. That team of people is so good at Paul Cooper and his team is so good at just creating an atmosphere and really letting you sit in what it would be like to live in this civilization from its founding to its rise and to its fall. And it's very good at telling you, like, geographically, here's a very specific spot in the world and why the way that it was formed was very important, why people would settle here in the first place, what types of foods they eat, what type of resources they have, that leads to the type of clothes that they make, the type of food that they eat. Even in something like the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, right? He goes into, there was clay and reeds, and those were incredibly abundant, and that's how they started writing cuneiform on their clay tablets with the reeds that they cut. And that is one of the reasons why they're so well preserved, is because of what they wrote on, because of what they had access to, right? So thinking about the setting and the things that these people would have access to and how they would sort of develop their culture based around their location is also very important. And yeah, so if you have like a fantasy setting that doesn't have like electricity or anything like that, the Fall of Civilization podcast is an incredible educational resource in general. Very beautiful podcast, very entertaining. I mean, I don't listen to like the podcast part, I watch the YouTube videos because there's incredible like B-roll that goes through the geographical location, shows you like maybe there's one part where like there's an excerpt of like a recipe and the video is of people making that recipe, right? So incredibly good. Watch the videos, listen to that podcast. So like things like that, as well as mythology and religion, are great places to draw from too. Something like One Piece draws from dozens of folk and mythological tales, from the Four Emperors to like the current Norse, the giant island that they're on right now in the manga, to of course the Nika, the sun god. Things like sea beasts are, something that's been around since Europeans were like trying to go to the New World. Of course, mermaids, the Adam tree and the Eve tree. I have so many theories about the Adam and the Eve tree in One Piece. It's not even funny. Things like angels, right? Oh my gosh, there's so many things with the different races in One Piece, and it's scratching the surface. Those are just the obvious things that I remember off the top of my head. One Piece is also good at creating a setting and a sandbox that the world takes place in. Because setting and world building aren't necessarily the same thing, but you can't have one without the other, right? Like how in the Fall of Civilizations podcast, the geography of the world is so important, and really informs how the structure is built around the people that settle there, which is sort of the same between setting and world building. How does the geography of the place that you put a society in help them develop their culture, I guess? Oda made a very specific environment for himself to tell the story that he wanted. The Grand Line, the isolated islands, and then of course the Red Line, literally having Marie-Joie being at the highest point in the world. That sort of metaphor he's incredibly heavy-handed with metaphors like that, which I appreciate, because not everything needs to be obviously he's incredibly subtle and masterful in other world building ways, but some of the things are so heavy-handed, and he kind of smacks you in the face with them. And sort of having that balance too of what you subtly want to tell people and what you want to slap people in the face with, but you don't necessarily need to tell them outright at the same time. People are smart, and if they don't get it, that's fine, but if they do get it, it'll be really cool for people who do, right? And then One Piece has things it's then revealed, 1,000 episodes later, the ancient weapons and all of this other world building and the sea levels, and you can tell things like Atlantis have also influenced Oda, and he is also a really good example of having a plan, he knows his end goal, but adding stuff as you go along and expanding the story. I mean, he's obviously an incredibly extreme example of expanding the story. Because what was it? He eventually wanted 3 vol or he eventually wanted to end it a lot sooner than he did. Yeah, I think Robert Jordan's a good example of that too, with the Wheel of Time. How it was the Wheel of Time that was originally supposed to be a trilogy and then ended at 14 books. But I mean, I think both of them, that is a blessing and a curse, because I feel for both One Piece and Wheel of Time, there are, gasp, controversial opinion, there are some things that could have been cut from both of those, and the story still would have been just as impactful. But that's just me. Things like One Piece, as well as things like The Adventure Zone Balance and Skyjacks, also have a balance of serious topics and humor. They make slapstick fart jokes inspired. They have a lot of especially One Piece and Skyjacks have a lot of inspired by Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry moments. But then they also talk about imperialism and colonialism and slavery and genocide and incredibly serious topics, and exploring ways that people can deal with those serious topics. But of course, that says something about humanity as well, because in times of strife and suffering, most people cope with humor and trying to make something good out of a bad situation, right? And there being a mystery to solve also creates a sense of intrigue. Maybe one of the sort of rules that you create in your world are unknown to the reader, and then it's revealed towards the end. Like, spoilers for One Piece. There's so much about One Piece, but the sea levels have been rising over the last few decades, and that was a sort of world building reveal. I mean, that's not the hugest reveal, because One Piece, like I said, has 1 million episodes, and there's so much to unpack there. So, I mean, if you want to read it, you still can. I think I personally just need to figure out, because, I mean, it's just all a tightrope, all a balancing act between all of these different things. Creating rules and structure for yourself, but leaving yourself open to change things as you go along. Because obviously, as you build a world, it is a, pretty long process, a big project, depending on how big you want it to be. So leaving yourself open to have new ideas and expand on thoughts you've had previously, or just completely change things altogether. Having a structure and rules for yourself, but leaving yourself open to that change and expansion. And then balancing things like the humor and the funny, but also the serious topics that you may want to explore in your world, right? Because if you're creating a world, there's going to be bad things in it. You just need to figure out what you want to talk about. Like Skyjacks wants to talk about, like colonialism and imperialism and like capitalism and anti-capitalism. Things like One Piece want to talk about like tough topics like slavery and genocide and that sort of like the world government, right? It's very, pirates versus the world government, very anti-government in that way, similar to Skyjacks. But Skyjacks doesn't really talk about things like slavery, right? So you want to go back and forth between what you want to, the bad things about humanity and the world that you want to talk about, and the things that maybe you're like, my world doesn't have that. I want my world to be better than our world in that regard. Right? I think that makes sense. That sort of balancing tightrope act. I think I also need to figure out what I really like to explore and draw, right? Because I love history. I love a bunch of different things like that, but particularly what I like to draw, right? How Mars, who makes Ride or Die, loves cars and hot rods specifically, so they are making a story around like car racing, like drag racing, right? And that is something that they really like exploring and really like drawing. So what would be my equivalent of that? I haven't really drawn birds, but I do like birds. I mean, I like the concept of birds. I think having a bird near me might be scary. But I like plants and nature. I do like clothes, and I mentioned sort of counterculture because I do think that sort of counterculture and counterculture fashion is also interesting, right? I did watch a lot of video essays about goth. I mean, going from like the Visigoths to like 90s goth music, right? I watched so many videos on just sort of how the meaning of the word has changed. Yeah, but having something that I really want to hyper-focus and do research on, and then that sort of evolves into drawing a story about them. Another thing is I'm not necessarily the best at drawing like conflict or arguments. So what do people like to argue about? What do people fight over? And not necessarily the macro sense of something like the Knights Templar and the Crusades, for example. Right, those sort of religious conquests. Or something like Alexander the Great, where he just sort of expanded his territory over continents, right? It doesn't need to be macro wars and fighting. Like, what, like, two businesses next to each other that have a rivalry and fight for customers, right? Like, what if they are two restaurants, or maybe two, like, inns or taverns if you're like a D&D-esque fantasy world, right? And those two people have had a rivalry for the last decade, right? What if it's siblings fighting over a toy, right? Stuff that's universal and timeless. Going back to the Fall of Civilization podcast, it was in the Assyrian Empire episode, I believe. He mentions a cuneiform tablet from a boy who was at school, and it is a letter to his mom complaining about how everyone has cooler clothes than he does, and his mom doesn't love him because he doesn't have as many clothes as his peers, right? That is something that I could imagine a kid calling his mom or texting his mom, right, last week about how he doesn't have the, like, newest Jordans or whatever the fuck the youths wear these days. I say, as I'm in my 20s. But right, he everyone else has the new XYZ and he doesn't. And his mom doesn't love him because he didn't buy it for her, right? Things like that are timeless interactions, right? And even hearing about that ancient cuneiform tablet made Assyria feel like more real to me, even though it was thousands of years ago, right? What songs do people sing and why, right? Every culture has songs that people sing while they're working, songs that they sing at weddings, at funerals, and songs of rebellion. And how long have those songs been around? Has their meaning changed or been lost? Okay, and I literally had to cut myself off because I realized that the video was ending and I had done my voiceover over the end of the video by a few minutes. So anyway, I'm done with this page 19, and I'm hoping to get page 20 done soon-ish. My hand's kind of been bothering me again, so we'll see how busy I am in the next few weeks and how my hand feels. But other than that, I hope you guys have a lovely day. Go watch something that you think is cool and go make something that you think is cool. Okay, bye-bye! Okay, chill out, dude. Chill out, dude. Oh my gosh. Everything's falling apart.